Awesome. Well, I'm super excited to be talking about this in particular, because I mean, this is the part of the ecosystem that I think I'm most passionate about. And I mean, over the last couple of days, we've seen these just amazing array of speakers, you know, titans of industry and doing crazy, crazy things. But honestly, it's not the idea of running a $100 billion company or having 10,000 employees that really excites me. What gets me going is taking this idea from a lab into the real world, and this spot where the rubber really meets the road. And it's I guess it's not usually thought of this way, but I often think of big pharma companies as more of, say, a record label than the band. Like that, in the end, they distribute and they sell products more than they build them. And I think roughly speaking, about 60% of the drugs, successful drugs that come out of big pharma originated somewhere else. So the majority of them. And the last stat I heard was showing that the partnered or in-licensed molecules and drugs are about twice as likely to be successful than the ones that are developed in-house. And that's a little bit shocking, but I bring this up not to diminish the role of big pharma in this ecosystem. I mean, in many respects, this is their ecosystem. But I bring it up because as Adina was doing her informal survey, it seems that a lot of people here are considering starting a company and making this jump from the lab into industry. And I think it's important to recognize that you can have a tremendous impact on medicine and human health in general. That the bulk of the innovations, the bulk of the drugs that are going to be altering the course of humans' lives over the next couple decades are going to originate from you guys, not from the giant company. And that's exciting to think about, really. And not that you can't do great things in it, but this little sliver is one that I'm particularly passionate about. And so we assembled this panel. It's interesting, we changed at the last minute if you've looked at the books. But we were kind of set up with a group of people who entered the space from very different positions. And so myself, got into bio with zero background in bio. Like I said, I want to go from computer science to gene therapy, and it was messy and fun, but it was not normal. And a lot of you guys would be going much more kind of down the center of the fairway. You come from a top-tier school, you make some awesome science, and you decide to figure out how to take it into the world. And then even somewhere in the middle as well. And so I think before we go any further, let's get started by having the panelists introduce themselves and say who you are, what you're doing, and how you got into this.
So hi, everyone. My name is Vivian. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Sparrho. So what we do at Sparrho is use augmented intelligence, which is a term thrown around quite a lot today, machine learning trained with a network of PhDs from around 150 countries now, to curate and summarize cutting-edge research. And we do that for many different companies and universities as a business model. How I got into this, I did not expect myself to be an entrepreneur. I had an interest in science and business. So I actually grew up in Australia, did my undergrad in biotech at the University of Queensland, specializing in drug design delivery. Then ended up networking my way into a VC role. But then I also got the opportunities to do a PhD, here and also in Oxford, and then I ended up choosing here in Cambridge. So I was just down the road for about 4 years, specializing in X-ray crystallography. So completely not at all related to what I'm doing at Sparrho, but why I started Sparrho was because of the problem that I actually personally experienced, first in venture capital, not knowing how to find, access, and understand cutting-edge research. And as an investor, and you'll hear a lot more from Simon as well, I had to go out and scoping and really understand, is this really the next CRISPR-Cas? What is the latest literature? What's the landscape, et cetera? And there you've got to know all the keywords before you can actually search for things. And then we had the paywall issue, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. And then you're staring at pages and pages of really technical content, which you're meant to be an expert in. But if you're trying to innovate outside your space, then it's really hard to understand. So I experienced the problem, didn't do anything about it. And then I had the opportunity to come here and do my PhD. And then that's when I started realizing a lot more of what's happening in the academic publishing world, which is actually very true. I actually aligned that to the record labels, actually. And I can talk about that a little bit later. But really from there, then I realized as a PhD in a cutting edge research, the university system helps you solve one of those three problems: accessibility in terms of paywall access, but doesn't necessarily make the finding or the understanding any easier. And that's where I ended up actually working on building a solution to my own problem, which has now ended up being an entrepreneur. So there's a couple of other stories that I probably won't bore you details with, but I'm sure it'll come out in the panel later on.
Hi everyone, so I'm Simon Turner. Unlike everyone else here, I am not an entrepreneur. These guys are the ones that are actually doing the things. I'm basically the voyeur that's looking in from the window, to put it this simply. So my background is it's Bachelor's of Biomedical Sciences, then Master's in International Business. I did the very classical thing. I went directly into consulting. Then after a couple of years of consulting, I went then into venture capitalism. So first specializing in orphan and rare diseases, then more into the IVD diagnostics and medical devices. So again, having people working in bioinformatics, I can tell you, it's really going to be big very soon. At least we're betting big time on it. Actually, a while ago, I quit VC, and I'm more working with startups. What I'm doing is helping them develop a vision and a strategy, preparing more of an equity story, and kind of investing in them in the long term, so helping very operational teams become much more developed in that sense. Why I found myself in these positions, basically, I just kind of fell into them, more or less. It was meeting the right person at the very right time who said, oh, well, you have an interesting academic background so far. Do you want to come and do an internship or something like that? Always be open, so say, sure, why not? Tell me more about it. One thing leads to another. You're sitting there, and suddenly you have a contract in front of you, and you're being employed. Then at some point, you get bored. And when you get bored, it's probably the right moment to start thinking, what's the next steps? Happened quite quickly for me. May do so for you, or you'll find something extremely passionate, and you'll kind of continue on from there. This is also why I'm working with startups. It's amazing. I mean, come on, you guys. You're basically creating the future of this entire sector, so just keep going with that.
Hi, my name is Dena Mohabbat, and I'm the CEO of Sparrho Genetics. And Sparrho Genetics makes bioinformatics software, and we specifically focus on the tools that are needed for doing population scale analysis, because our thesis is really, if we're going to understand anything about the genome, the only way we're going to do that is by comparing hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people, to actually pick out the genetic variations that are really important for various diseases and conditions. You may be surprised to learn that I got into this through a business plan competition. I majored in psychology at the University of Washington, so that totally makes sense for starting a bioinformatics company. But basically, I was in a business plan competition, not dissimilar from the one we just did here. And it was in my senior year, and I met my first co-founder, Becky Dries, who was a molecular biologist PhD out of Berkeley, and she and I got together, and she had an idea for a genetic analysis company. It was a very different idea at the time. It was much closer to something like a 23andMe, but we won. And it was 2009, the economy was kind of in the toilet, so to speak, and so if we really looked at it, I had the option of find a job or make a job, and make a job sounded way more interesting. And I didn't know what I was doing really at all. Like, I had to learn everything from scratch. I'd had no business training. But I mean, here I am 8 years later, and it's been quite the journey. But for me, the reason why I was really willing to actually go through the crazy learning curve and the pain and the suffering that all goes with starting a company like this is because I really wanted to make this kind of scale of impact. I'd been involved in a couple of other startups while I was in college, one in home automation and one at smart grid, and both of those are totally cool. Like, turning your lights on and off with your cell phone is cool, and it makes zero difference for humanity. And so if I was going to spend my time and my energy doing something, I wanted to do something that really would be impactful for the world. So that's me.
Awesome. Well, so we just saw this group of fun pitches, and I don't know how many here are considering actually pursuing these things. And I recognize that this might be the first foray into entrepreneurship or considering this that a bunch of you in the audience have really kicked around. And so I thought it'd be helpful for this panel specifically to talk about kind of more the nitty-gritty aspects of it. So from the time, it's one thing to look at like a $100 billion company and be like, wow, if I could only go to my boss and ask for $200 million and 300 people, that would be awesome. And that would be awesome. But since I'm not, and I think most people here are not, how do you go from I have an awesome idea or some killer science and I want to see it change the world? And so we've got a couple of questions to basically get us started down this path. But my plan was to effectively turn this over to you guys as a discussion. So we'll get started with a couple, and then you can think of questions and see what kind of trouble we can cause. And so I think one of the first ones we kicked around, if you're thinking about coming out of academia in particular to start a company, one of the first things you have to deal with usually is tech transfer. And you have to get this IP out of the lab and into your new company. And in my experience, there's a pretty wide range from very nice, well-oiled machines, tech transfer offices, to ones that are like something from Deliverance, basically, that it would just a terrible mess. And so I wanted to kind of float this by everyone here and say, what are your experiences at the first step? And if there's something even before that, feel free to go back as well. But like from the moment you decide, I want to start the company, what's the first thing you have to do? Or what's the first thing you guys did in your companies?
So I guess as an entrepreneur, Sparrho is all of the IP in Sparrho was owned in-house. But I can probably more relevantly talk about my experience as the investor side, because we actually dealt with a lot of the tech transfers coming out of the top 3 universities in Australia. And I think the very first thing that we always had to identify was where did the IP lie? And each university has a different structure. So I think that's the first one to do, is double check your university structure. Yeah. If, for example, if you're in the PhD realm, or especially if you're planning to co-found with a postdoc, that's where it gets interesting. So at least from my understanding, some of the universities, the IP with a PhD student, depending on your kind of funding bodies as well. So you have to check the IP on your funding scholarships as well. But generally the students own the IP. However, a postdoc is an employee of the university, then the university might own the IP. And that's where you have to talk to your tech transfer and really sort of understand what the complexity is, and they will be much more experienced in understanding and dealing with teams with where there's a bit of complexity with intellectual property.
So from the investor side, and both of you guys who've done an investment, how often is this an issue? Like when, how big of a problem is this, and how often does it go sideways or go perfectly?
Well, again, I mean, I come from a VC that was based in Paris. In Paris, intellectual property is a little bit different from, I think, the rest of Europe, in fact, in that you have multiple disciplinary teams that are often working together. So you have about 4 or 5 different institutes which have rights to IP at times. So getting just to know who can I deal with when it comes to getting information about the patents and where they lie and how to actually begin licensing discussions can take months, if not even up to a year. And in tech transfer, this is not rare, at least in my experience.
Is exclusivity like less common in France than elsewhere? I mean, typically there's one holder of IP in the United States, and there might be a lot of names on it, but there's one office. Like, can you, in theory, license the same thing for multiple institutions in France?
In theory, you can at least begin the discussions. Then I don't think you can actually do the actual licensing process. But I mean, they're trying to get this all together. But the initial phase, at least, before they've kind of gone to the tech transfer institutes, which have been set up and things, you've got kind of 3 or 4 different departments and 3 or 4 different institutes arguing with each other, or at least trying to clarify their position, because sometimes it's not been done beforehand. And I think this is something that's very important. If you're going to start thinking about filing IP, again, with different universities and things, good idea to discuss, okay, if IP comes out, how are we going to handle this at the very start? Because if you deal with it immediately, it's not going to be an issue. And when somebody like an investor or, let's say, a pharma company or whatever, a medical device comes, at least that part is cleared up. Because then we're only looking at the risk of the actual invention not working. It's not the actual, invention and the legal process behind it.
There's an interesting wrinkle for those of you from the United States that I did all the time, in that whenever I was embarking on a new academic collaboration, like the day before you sign your agreement, basically, file a provisional staking claims to all of like my ideas for it. And then you cite that provisional in your pre-existing IP thing. And this, I don't know how common that kind of behavior is, but the goal of it wasn't to somehow like pull something over on the institution. It was that like as a general rule, the more you can like codify, the better. Because it's very easy 2 years later for someone to be like, "Ah, that's totally my idea,"
Yeah.
and you'd be like, especially when you're, poor Matt, who is not the fancy scientist, they're not going to believe that Matt invented it, and so I'll lose that argument. And so I'm like, oh, actually, funny thing is I have this documented record of it, so that's great. And it also can provide you with a very useful bargaining chip when you deal with the licensing department later, especially if they're trying to claim it later. And so the European system doesn't have provisional patents, so which limits that because you have to make a much more developed document to do something similar here. But I would just throw it out there as it is really a good idea if you're going to be engaging with a third-party academic institution to clarify the IP position before you do it. You can get in a lot of trouble. All right, well, so another topic that is probably, if you were to boil it down to one thing that would have a bigger influence than anything else over the well-being and success of your startup, it's probably the team that you put together. I forget which one of the panelists made the comment that an A team with C technology will beat out a C team with A technology any day, and I think that's an accurate assessment. And so, how did you guys go about building a team when you decided you wanted to do this? And hopefully it dawned on you at some point that you can't do it all yourself, and then you started. And hopefully that was early enough that you didn't waste too much time. But there'll be a transition from when it's your crazy idea to when it's a living, breathing company. And how did you manage the recruitment of that and building your team?
Okay, so for me personally, actually, I got involved in the societies actually. So how I ended up finding like-minded people, or rather get myself into the entrepreneurship journey, was I ended up being part of QTech here at Cambridge, which was the Cambridge University Technology and Enterprise Club. I guess people got interested in my VC background, and then all of a sudden I got thrown into this great club, but actually that's where I met a lot of other PhDs or like-minded people who are probably trying to get out of academia or try to explore entrepreneurship as a whole. Through there, that was where I met some of the angel investors, and that's another beauty of why I think Cambridge was really amazing here, was because within 20 minutes cycle ride, you can have access to top researchers, access to companies around here. Now that AstraZeneca's also moved their headquarters here as well, then access to angel investors, and a whole bunch of interesting mix of people that you might need to encounter and ask you the hard questions to start the company. Luckily for me, I think through the QTech, and I ended up being the president of QTech, where I learned a lot more of the how do you manage a team of 50 unpaid bright minds in the world, and trying to run the team to try to run one of the world's largest student-led conferences and have a, it was a hierarchy inherited from the MIT universities. And we actually had a fundraising team, I had a marketing team, I had, all the various different teams laid out while we were all trying to finish our PhDs. So time management was definitely something I had to learn the hard way while I was doing that. And then through there, then I got exposed to another serendipitous opportunity, where then at that point, London was trying, or number 10 Downing Street was trying to make London the next entrepreneurship bubble.
So how big of an issue is that for you guys? I mean, one problem you've got is you need to build a team, but another problem might be you can't pay them right away. So I mean, getting 50 people to work for free is a pretty impressive maneuver, I'd say. And
you can do anything to put something on your CV.
Yeah. So is that the carrot, like typically, or did you guys, when you got started, how much did you have to pay them right away, and how far can you go with this, and how far would you recommend going with it actually? Like, as you build a team, maybe kind of building on this and how it was done. When do you cross this line from saying I've got all these rock stars who are on my advisory board, who I don't pay, to we're an actual functioning team?
So I'll take the first stab at that one. I think that in the United States, at least, it's been an interesting transition, and what used to work and what currently works is different. Because it used to be that you could do like unpaid internships and that kind of stuff, but all of that stuff has gone out the window. That's not allowed anymore. And so if you have people that are non-officers of the company, you have to pay them at least minimum wage. And so that makes it different in terms of how you do startups. And so for me, I mean, at this point, it's pretty much initially it's the officers of the company, so the people that are the co-founders. You can do, like quite a bit of time doing the unpaid, like we're gonna work out of a garage or your kitchen table or whatever it is, like kind of early stage stuff. But then at some point, for us, we really found that it had enough legs. Like we had done a bunch of research, we'd done initial prototypes, and we talked to enough initial customers that we were like, okay, no, this is real. And then at that point, you're like, okay, well, if I'm gonna raise money, the first people you really raise money from are your friends and family. That's typically how it goes. And so for me, the moment that it gets really real is the moment that you like go to grandma and you're like, hey, will you invest like, a couple $1,000s in my company? And that's really like, for me, that's like really the transition point is like, I had to be confident enough in myself and like the research that we'd done and the team that we had put together such that I was actually willing to make that ask. And I mean, in the early stages, because you don't really have that much to show for yourself, really the only people that will invest in you are like those 3 Fs, like friends, family, and fools, right? Because you don't have anything to show for yourself. The only thing that they can really go on is like knowing you, right? And so the only people that will have any confidence in investing in you are your friends and your family. So that's kind of, the transitional line for us was like that moment of feeling like we were confident enough. And even then, I mean, even looking back now, I would say, even then it was still a little bit like on the edge. Like the readiness is an interesting conversation because I think that we as entrepreneurs tend to be optimistic to a certain extent. And so
it's a requirement, I think.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's a requirement. And so, I mean, it sure seemed ready at the time. Now with a little bit more experience, I don't know if we were really ready, but we did it anyway.
It's interesting. I've gone, so the first biotech I did, it was like pulling teeth to get it funded. Like it was brutal. It was starting gene therapy when gene therapy was a bad word, and having no background in gene therapy was not an award-winning combination. And like it was, the amount of hacking you should be prepared to do if you're starting a company is a lot. And so I mean, back then, I didn't have a lab. I got one organization to make a prototype virus for me. I was stashing it elsewhere and got visiting scientist status at a third lab to test it, and in exchange for letting them play with my fancy virus. And so like it was all this to get the first data, like a couple glowing cells, a couple things making these broadly neutralizing antibodies back then. But the second one was interesting that people threw money at it since the day it started. Like in fact, the whole thing got started like at a bar after an event, and I was like talking about another scientist. I was like, oh, that's fascinating, but I do it differently. And this guy's like, how'd you do it? And I spit out this idea. He's like, it has to happen. And I was like, well, I have a company. I can't do another. And it's like, if you write it up, I'll fund it. Like, and I'll raise more money for you. It just has to happen. And so there's I was always jealous of the people who seem to have piles of money just flowing in for no apparent reason. And that wasn't a very big pile, but it still made me much happier as it went. It's definitely better than the alternative. But so I guess this is a good question to think about. Like when do you really need to get the money? Like if getting the money is to make it real, like and to a certain extent it is. Like my credit limit's only so high, and once that's maxed, then I have to get someone else's money. And so when did you guys decide it was time to get extra money, or when would you recommend people do it? If those two are different.
Maybe I'll attack this one.
Sure, go for it.
So I guess this question is extremely difficult to answer because, I mean, depending on where you are and who you are, it's going to be very different. If you can get a core team together and you have enough belief in the product, you'll find that core team can stick around for a very long time just with the drive and the knowledge that one day this will succeed. Once you start building outside of that and having, should we say, not the most extremely essential people, but still essential, that's when it becomes a bit more difficult not being able to pay them. And that's when it begins to come into this question of, okay, now how do we do this? Do we raise money? Do we do something else? Do we find some sort of a way or structure for it? Again, this is an external impression of this. I've seen it in a couple of different companies in a couple of different ways being done. I think they'd all basically say, more or less, the sooner we can get the money, the better, period.
So for me, was about MVP, so minimal viable product. And I had the vision, and the vision's never changed from day one. But even the MVPs have changed, and the journey has kept going like this. But our vision was to democratize scientific knowledge to the day that someday, like my grandmother can understand cutting-edge arthritis research in her own language whenever she wants to. So that vision has never changed. It's a very big one, but we're hoping that it will get there somewhere. But the first thing I had to do, especially when I was trying to convince other people right after my PhD, why scientific research was so important to a wider community outside of academia was very hard. I didn't really know how to pitch it, so I was really bad at actually doing the digital scientific communication. So therefore, I actually had to learn coding. Well, this is actually where my relationship with my co-founder came about, because he was machine learning from Oxford. And we got together because through this Entrepreneur First program, which is very different now. But at the beginning, it was just meant to be the top 30 bright minds in the UK that want to be entrepreneurs. And somehow we got together. And so I wanted to learn how to code in order to build exactly what I had up here as a first MVP. And so he taught me Python, and that was where the whole relationship started. The more that I was telling him why I was trying to do what I was doing, and he was like, actually, that's interesting. Yes, I see that problem. I see that problem too. And then all of a sudden, that's how we became co-founders. And then in terms of the reality of the money aspect of it, was I think the beauty of being able to surround yourself by building networks. Those angel investors in Cambridge ended up also being part of my first angel investors. Or they introduced me to the first person, who was actually Alistair Mitchell, still is my chairman from this day. But he was one quick phone call, he was in the Valley, 45 minutes from the Silicon Valley, and he said, love this idea, I'm gonna put money behind it, now use my name and see what you can do in 3 months. And then I closed to, initial pot of money. It was only like 250K back in those days, but it was 250K in 3 months' time from someone who absolutely believed in it. Yeah. And this was a very interesting moment, because a couple of years ago, especially in that space, I think the US used to do this a lot better. There was a lot more ability and capital, but also ability to do projects and try different things. And so it was much more usual for an angel investor to just decide to throw money in within 45 minutes, which was very different to what I experienced personally in the European ecosystem a couple of years ago, which is different now. A lot of things have changed, but it was that pin drop moment when I hung up the phone call with Alistair, and I went, wow. Crap. First I was stressed. First it wasn't like, okay, this is now going to be actually no longer just a dream. And I freaked out. And then I think naivety kicked in, and I think being naive is actually one of the best things you can have. Because I had no idea what I was getting myself into. Only until I actually had to prepare all the due diligence documentations, and I was like, crap. But yeah, that was my pinpoint moment. And then I think also at that point of having other people trusting you with their own money puts a huge sense of reality check. And that then is also a validation check for what, even if it's just the vision at that point, and maybe some crappy MVP that I hacked together. But it was a really interesting reality check that actually just changed the mentality, and then therefore the team then also changed in terms of thinking of it as a wishy-washy thing to a...
Yeah, now it's prove us right.
Crap, yeah.
And the oh crap moment is one that it's a hallmark of entrepreneurship. It is interesting on the fundraising thing. I think my record was I had a guy give me like $250,000 in less than 5 minutes of conversation, and it was basically like, you have about a minute to explain yourself before he's gone, and it's like, all right, how much do you want? And I was like, $250,000. And he's like, okay. And then other ones who will just rake you over the coals over nonsense. I mean, I have, varying experience with due diligence teams for investors. Like, some of these idiots are just insufferable. And I'm like, I don't know what you got your PhD in, but clearly know nothing about this project. But as a general rule, you're not allowed to tell the diligence people they're full of shit. So it doesn't always reflect well on you. So you have to, that's a great question. Remember this. But, all right. So let's see. Well, I guess we're actually about the the halfway point here. And so I wanted to leave the bulk of this time for you guys to ask questions, not knowing exactly where you're coming from. So do we have questions for the panel right now to start us out?
Okay.
All right, well, you're the first one. Yes, you.
I wanted to ask something about the exclusivity in Paris that you talked about. If you could elaborate on that a little bit more on the IP side.
Okay, so exclusivity in the sense that we were discussing it is who's looking after the IP, so when it's being filed and when it's being prepared for being out-licensed or being put into a company. So each of you come from a big institute. They normally have tech transfer offices. I think in the UK it's relatively well organized in terms of who has the rights or should be the person of contact for discussing an out-licensing or potentially a company creation based on that IP. In France, it can be a little bit more variable simply because you have different institutes coming from different centers who are working together, and it's not always prepared at the start of it. In theory, you're supposed to have these regional tech transfer offices that kind of look after this. Some do it extremely well, some do it not as well, and some, well, we wonder if they do it at all. So it's very variable. I don't think it's the same issue you'd have here, at least from your institutes, maybe from ones which are less experienced in filing IP or at least generating mass amounts of IP. I'm not sure if that answers the question completely, or...
I would say, as a general rule, become good friends with your tech transfer department.
Yeah, very much so.
I mean, some groups are really top notch at this. Like Stanford, has a program where they will like actually give you money to try to commercialize their IP. Like they'll give you like little seed grants. It's to do proof of concept data. Some are amazing, but in general, I mean, you should be trolling around that office a lot, and to see what's there. I mean, it might as well, right? You have a license to get away with pretty much anything you want when you're a student, and so you can go grab these things.
I think that's, you've touched on you have a student card, use the student card. You can get away with anything, and you can make phone calls to people that should not return your phone calls when you're a student, and they will return your phone calls. And they will answer questions that they probably shouldn't answer. I mean, I remember
Especially.
I mean, I remember calling up people that were pseudo-competitive and asking them questions, and they would totally answer because it's like, oh, well, you're a student, I want to help out. Use it while you got it. It's an amazing, amazing card.
I have a question about the capital-intensive nature of companies in gene therapy or antibody technology or anything like that. How do you raise that type of money? Because in tech, I mean, you can code out of your bedroom or the garage, and when you're trying to work with antibodies, that requires a lot of additional space and technology.
Yeah. Well, this actually was something we were kicking around back when we were discussing what we were going to talk about. It's how much of a plan is important? Because I think this gets at this, the amount of money you should raise. Someone had brought this up yesterday that you have to basically reach an increase in value, a milestone with the money that you get to be able to get more money. And so in general, first of all, use as much as you can that's free. I mean, you can hijack labs. I have elevated hijacking academic labs to a high art. I mean, it's phenomenal. I've got whole labs that I don't think they do anything else now. I just control them. It's fun. And so you should do that. But I guess for the people, you've been on the other side of this table, when you've got someone hatching up a scheme that is going to be capital intensive, maybe put it a little differently, what do you need to see from them to give them that check? Because I think that's kind of where you're going to get at. We know it's going to cost a lot of money. The question's what's going to make them give you that money?
I'm not going to try and paraphrase everything that was said in the previous panel, so of course, excellent team, absolutely a must. When we see kind of a business plan or something like that, you look at it and you know it's not going to hold up in the long run. You know it's just something, a hypothesis that was made today. What personally I've been looking for always is to understand why has the team drawn up what they've drawn up, in fact. What is the logic behind it? How have they thought through this and developed it? What I'm looking for is kind of a vision approach. So it's to say, okay, this is where we want to get to. This is how we believe we will get there. We know it's going to need more money. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen a startup not need more money, in fact, when they pitched, in the versus reality of things. But that's okay. It's been prepared for. We've already thought about it. You can raise another round. Again, as long as the idea is solid, as long as you have a clear vision in terms of where you want to get, and that vision is very strong, I think we're quite happy about it. after that. It's very individualized afterwards.
Yeah, to add to that, I mean, there's now a couple of really great programs out there, especially when you're talking about, like, my MVP is going to be very, very different to an MVP for a stem cell research startup, for example. And now there's actually quite a lot of models out there, for example, like Deep Science Ventures. That's coming out. It was a spin-off from Imperial, but it literally is they have enough money now to actually build labs. And so they do take on entrepreneurs, but not as teams with ideas, but just smart people who want to be entrepreneurs, and you actually get access to labs. And you can do hacking all different kind of projects you want, but yes, still use your student card if you can, and just hijack other people's labs. But if you want to go down the formal route, and actually there are programs like Deep Science Ventures now, there's accelerators out in the US that do this a lot more, even more experience on this. And then you also have other even crowd platforms online, even if you know specifically that you want to rent a HPLC. Right, you can use some of the, you can actually go online, find some of the equipment and the lab spaces and test some stuff out if you really need to get some sort of MPP just to showcase your research if you don't have an association with a research facility right now.
Yeah, I think one thing that's important to consider as you're starting a company like this is when do you want to engage with industry in general? You know, when should you be talking to pharma companies? And one thing that can be very helpful is that companies now like J&J with the J-Labs initiative, for example, I think is pretty phenomenal. Like where these guys are actively reaching out to find companies like this and can provide a lot of things like lab space and can make the capital-intensive project less capital-intensive. And so I think your ability to leverage other things to get it over the goal line is very important.
Hi, I'm Sissy from Singapore. So I have a particular question to Vivian. So I definitely share your view about democratized science, but I'm wondering when you create your platform, how did you manage to get the universities researchers to trust your platform to be able to you know, the tech transfer office definitely will say that I actually want to keep it confidential for some while. We would like to approach the investors instead of like just giving all the science and all these details to you to let you publicize. Yeah.
That's a great question. There's two parts to that question. There is user acquisition and there's trust. But also just to give a bit of context of what we do, we initially spent the first couple of years building machine learning technology to check over 60 million, well, we now have over 60 million pieces of scientific content. So we understood the core heart of scientific research was initially in research papers. So there's a lot more like in terms of conference posters, preprints, and a whole bunch of stuff, but we needed to start somewhere. So we built technology that now checks over 50,000 journals every hour, faster than Thomson Reuters, Reed Elsevier, on the latest of research. But in order for that to happen, and then for stepwise to get to democratization, we need to understand how you create relevant content to different stakeholders along the chain. So from there, yes, that's part of the products. There's NLP, and there's a whole bunch of multi-factor algorithms that we have in place. But really where the PhD network comes in is that they use the tool to help them stay on top of research. But then they also use what we also call PIM boards, which is a bit, actually some of the Reddit users are better at marketing than we are. They call it the Pinterest for Geeks, which is a visual collection of articles where PhD experts themselves are better than machines and joining nonlinear connection points. And going, okay, this mathematical equation here is very important and very interesting that I could apply to solve an agricultural problem. And by them actually training and pinning articles that might not actually have any relevance on research in terms of references and citations, that's when they start to further train the algorithms. But then now they're also starting to generate summaries. And these are expert-generated summaries, which we have a separate R&D project on to train more machine learning. But those summaries are now exclusive content, but open kind of CC BY license to everyone and anyone who actually wants to understand science and look at the supporting science. Then on top of that, then we have an editorial team now that actually looks at the best PIM boards that are submitted from now 150 countries to then work with the experts and now digest down to a 3-minute digest. And so every week even, people then actually within 3 minutes see what's cutting edge research in a particular area of T cells that actually was relevant to a HIV discovery, for example. And then see who's the researcher behind it, and then look at all the research papers that have been distilled. And that's how you discover research without having to know the keyword search element of it. So it's slightly different to saying we're uploading research papers or kind of disclosing cutting edge research. It is what existing research out there is already out there, which is funded by taxpayers. Different countries have different methodologies, but a lot of the scientific research, especially here in this country, is taxpayer funded. However, as taxpayers who have now a lot of questions and knowledge on their digital fingertips, can't still understand what's happening in cutting edge science, that's where we're trying to generate many different types of content, which is relevant for various different people.
So you don't have to answer this on the record, but how does this fit in with like Sci-Hub?
Yes. So Sci-Hub gives you access to research papers. And I think open access movement is happening and is already going to start generating. We're seeing it from the Wellcome Trust. The funding bodies themselves are taking a more proactive approach, which is then causing a lot of the publishers to question their next revenue model. And that's where I'm seeing some similarities of what happened with the music industry to what's actually happening with the publishing industry. But we foresee the fact that open access is going to happen, which just means more data. Just because you have more access to research papers doesn't mean that you want to read them.
Doesn't mean you understand
it's relevant to you all the time. And this is where, and that just makes, with its existing technology of Boolean keyword search, means that you still need to know what you're looking for to find those papers. And that's where we're jumping ahead of that and knowing, helping you discover what you might want to see and working backwards.
All right. We have more questions here? Yes.
I was just wondering, is there any major decisions, like there's a lot of open moments, of course, but is there any major decisions you actually like regretted, and if you go back in time, you would want to change or do anything with that?
Yeah.
Start somewhere.
Let's see. Hiring friends. That one sucked. I mean, because like you have so this particular person. I mean, we had the entire conversation of we're gonna put the friendship first, and if it's not working from a business perspective, we'll break it off, and it'll still be fine, and blah blah blah. You have that entire conversation up front, and then the reality is that that's not always how it goes, and so it wasn't working, and so I let her go, and oh my gosh, she was super, super mad at me. She never talked to me ever again, and it sucked. Because, here's this person that I really cared about, and that's just, they're the realities of that sometimes. I mean, even if you think you've had a really mature conversation ahead of time, it doesn't necessarily make the difference. And so, if I could go back and, not hire her in the first place, that would have been good. But that's not what happened, and I learned a valuable lesson that way. And it's interesting, as I'm saying it, I'm thinking about companies that I want to start in the future, and a lot of the people that I would want to have as co-founders are also friends, and so it's this really interesting kind of challenge of the people that you know and trust tend to be your friends, but then at the same time startups are stressful, emotions get high, and there's no real good answer for that, but that particular one sucked a lot.
Yeah, your team is it's like a spouse, and it can end up with a very unhappy marriage if things go sideways. And I found that to be a challenge in particular starting out, that when you're not paying people and you have an idea that's not fully baked and you're trying to figure out how to pull these together, sometimes it's just the people who show up and who might not be the best fit for where you're going to go eventually. And I think that's a serious challenge, and I found it difficult. I mean, part of this is how sure are you of yourself and your vision? And because if you don't have those two things and you pull in people who don't share them, there will be consequences for that, and they're not going to be nice usually.
So you look at me. Okay, I have a lot of Kodak moments. I was just thinking in my head which ones to even mention. Team is definitely, but I feel also it is a really interesting question, but I wouldn't do anything differently, because I think failing is part of the success, or has molded the way that I am today and molded Sparrho. And I think the faster you fail, the better. And so there were so many Kodak moments that I wish I'd done this and I wish I'd done that. But really, now that I'm here to this day, I don't think I would try to change it. Yes, there would be, if I were to start a second business, there would be slightly different things that I would change in terms of the team. Also, I would probably try to get, this is just the nature of the business. We're a B2B R&D business. So actually, if I were to start a second business, I probably want to actually get paying clients before I build anything. And maybe even not actually go down a typical route. But then also, I think there was a lot of team. I think team issues were always, I think the 3 Ps, and this is the 3 Ps that I stand for, especially as a CEO, is people first, then product, then profit. If you any way, shape, or form change that combination, or you forget the order of priority, then things mess up. Then you get a B team. You know, you have a part of an A team and a part of a B team to try to sort out profit, and it just becomes very confusing. And I think even with the team side of things, team is not just internal team, it's about external team. So therefore, it's all the investors that I have and all the people like Alistair Mitchell and Sir David Cleveley and everyone else who is now part of my family, as I call it. And maintaining those relationships are absolutely key, but I've failed in many of them too.
I have a question for the panel. I've noticed that young people today are essentially burdened by debt and by more and more risk. Social safety nets are being cut across the globe. And entrepreneurship is essentially about managing risk and taking on risk. Do you see this impacting the young entrepreneurs in the ecosystem? And how do we keep this from becoming a major gap? Thank you.
I mean, I would say that risk is something that everybody deals with, right? And so, I mean, I guess the question is like, when do you want to take risk? Do you want to take it when you're younger, or do you want to take it when you're older? I mean, the math that I did was like, you know what? Right now, like, especially when I started, it's like, I'm young, I'm not married, my greatest responsibility is like to my cat, I don't have a car payment. Like, if everything goes to like hell in a handbasket, I can go and like call my mom and sleep on her couch for a couple of months, right? Like, yes, like there's things like debt and things like that that you need to manage for and deal with. But like, the reality is that if you wait longer, right? I mean, when you're in your like, you know, mid to late 30s, like, well, then you're like starting to like be married and like have responsibilities, not just to your cat, but to like children and like all of those, and you've got mortgages and all of these other things. And so, I mean, I don't know. I think that honestly, like coming out of university and going straight into startup is probably one of the least risky times to do it, especially because you're learning so much, and like the opportunity cost that you have, it's just a different calculation. You know, you're not leaving a, you know, $150,000 per year job to like start this thing. You're, you know, coming out, and you probably wouldn't ever make that much anyway, more than likely, unless you happen to be in like the software development side of the world in like Silicon Valley, right? And so, I don't know. I think that it's definitely something that is an issue, but it may not actually be as much of an issue as like all of the other things that come later in terms of risk.
Yeah, I think that the debt issue is significant, and it's why, you know, I was working with programs that pay kids to drop out of college. But I think actually, in terms of the safety net and the risk profile, like entrepreneurs will keep starting companies for the same reason, like birds keep flying and tigers keep pouncing. Like, they're just going to do it anyway. And so I wouldn't really expect you to see a serious shift in that behavior. I mean, even in places where, you know, standard of living is at the life or death type of age, people still are busy starting companies. I think it has much more to do with the person and their passion than the circumstance. And so as much as I would love to see us, you know, cranking out tons of scientists who weren't up to their eyeballs in debt and like becoming slaves of the corporate world when they start, I think you're gonna still do it. Like, I'd still do it.
Yeah, I guess it's calculated risk, and I think it's spot on. It is going to be down to the person and personality traits and etc. But now, I mean, if you probably would argue that you're in a better position these days to be able to test your ideas and actually even get funding, even through people like crowdfunding platforms, for people to pay stuff for you before you even actually build anything. And entrepreneurship is always been there, but maybe never been glorified or packaged the way that it is now. And there's always been entrepreneurs, and I think all the investors tell me this at the same time. Once you've been bit by the entrepreneur bug, that's it.
Yeah.
You're bit for life.
Some of us are not built to ever work in like large corporate environments.
Yeah, and you
I think
eventually
I would
make
be
yourself
excited.
unemployable. So
Yeah,
then you're
exactly.
really stuck. So
Well, that to me is kind of the risk. If you go into kind of the corporate side of things, you get into the big company, you do that whole thing, and you work your way up from start all the way up to eventually be a director or something like that. Okay, that's a very classical approach. If you get into entrepreneurship very early, I think it's very true. You get bitten by this bug, and suddenly kind of looking at that, and you just kind of think, I could probably never ever do that. In fact, I'm just not suited to that anymore, or at least there would be a clash, an enormous one that needs to be figured out ahead of time. So it is kind of a risk in that sense, because you're then kind of saying, okay, I'm selecting an opening option in this, but I'll probably do it again later on anyways. I still believe though, when you're young at this stage, I mean, go do it, just try it. I mean, you fail, guess what? You've learned an incredible amount. You succeed, well, congratulations.
And
next.
I would say you're more employable probably after having done that, because the thing
what
that's
to look out for.
Well, and also you get to do everything because you have to do everything.
Yeah.
It's not like you get to assign it to the marketing team. There is no marketing team. You're the marketing team, so figure it out.
Yeah.
Right?
I don't know if it's true, but one of my mentors mentioned that as a startup or as an entrepreneur, you are definitely a lot more employable these days, because they compare it to dog years. You're 1 year in a startup, you actually equals X amount of years in a corporate. The amount of learnings that you have to do because you're thrown in the deep end. No one is going to help you. So I don't know if that's true, but I like to think so.
Well,
I'll put that on my CV one day.
Yeah.
I would also encourage you guys to think about, in the end, you're going to bet on something. Whether you're betting that the big company will be there tomorrow or your pension will, that's still a bet. Like in the end, like I decided I'd rather be betting on myself. Like, and I'd rather crash and burn on my own merits or succeed. And so, I mean, at the heart of all of this, like if you're going to take the plunge and start a company, it's got to be because you both love what you're going to do and you believe it matters. And because it's going to be brutal no matter what. And so, I mean, then you're just saying, well, would I rather be betting on like, the big company or the government or anyone else, or would you rather be, betting on your dreams?
The only thing that I would add to that actually comes back to your Kodak moment previously. One thing that I would learn now that I did in the earlier days is that startup is not a sprint, it's a marathon.
Oh yeah.
So I burnt out way too quickly, too soon. And so now I'm actually looking after myself better, just so that I can be a better CEO. That's one thing I would change differently.
Yeah, I think that there's this myth that's really unhealthy actually, that like the only way to start a company is like you must work like 80 hours plus a week or something like that. And I really used to believe that. And it's also the rhetoric that you get from places like Silicon Valley. It's like if you're not killing yourself, you're not really gonna do it. Like you're not really in it. And I think that that's a big load of BS. Like that's a really, really short-term kind of thinking thing. And I think that that actually is encouraged by a lot of the accelerators, right? You're in a 3-month program and you have to produce and like do all of that stuff. But like it really is not helpful because it really is a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah, to consider as a rough timeline for a biotech startup that you're gonna be doing this for the next decade. And just off the top, like, in fact, when I was switching from tech into bio, the last tech company I did took me about 5 years to grow it and sell it. And I was thinking, well, this seems twice as hard. So would I be happy doing it for 10 years? And that was weird criteria, I know. But basically, I mean, we're at year 9 now, getting ready to go into clinic. And so I think about it on that scale. Like if you can't maintain your pace for a decade, your pace is probably a little too juiced.
And I think that also speaks to like, it better be something you really, really,
Yeah,
really
yeah.
care about. Because like, if it goes poorly, you'll be doing it for like 3 years. If it goes well, you'll be doing it for, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, right? And so it better be something you really care about.
I think for all of us, being around the same age or slightly younger, perhaps the panelists on the stage, it would be really cool if you guys could share one specific moment as much detail as specifically possible, because I think that's also something that's going to be very tactile for us to remember of a difficult decision that you faced in each of your respective companies.
You want to go first?
Oh,
You're the chair.
I'm the chair.
We're
I'm
gonna
not supposed
make
to
you
be.
do it.
I'm not the panel. Oh gosh. I think probably the biggest or the most difficult thing was really at the beginning, and that I mean I had plenty of people who thought this whole idea was a terrible one, and in my case I was making a choice to leave something I was good at to do something I knew nothing about. And so this decision of like, you know what, you're trading up a pretty big advantage, you know, to go out and be at the very bottom rung of this thing. And to do that, you have to basically, I guess, manage a combination of being hard-headed enough to keep just taking the abuse and going, but also teachable enough and humble enough to take the advice that you can get and when you crash and burn, not to like blame the world, but to like figure out what you did wrong and fix it. So I think for me is at the beginning. There was actually something I don't even really like saying out loud, but I think it's true, is that if I had gotten funded earlier on, I probably would have just screwed it up and crashed and burned. Like there was something about having to like claw through it and work out those problems at a small scale that allowed us to shatter some barriers when we got more money.
I think the hardest moment for me was, so look, nobody will tell you this, but like it doesn't matter how good you are, you're gonna get really close to running out of money or run out of money at least a couple of times. Mm-hmm. It's just how it is. Like, if you look at the statistics of companies, like it's like what, only 9 out of 10 ever get funding, and out of those, only 1 out of 5 will ever deliver product in exchange for any amount of money to a customer, and then out of those, only a tiny, tiny percentage of them ever like sell for as much money was invested in the company, right? And so if you just like think about those statistics, like you're dancing like on the knife edge all the time. And so for me, like the hardest one was like the first time I had to fire my entire team because we were out of cash. And I mean, gosh, that was just heartbreaking. Now, fortunately for me, like, you know, I had learned early enough on to be really honest with my team so they knew it was coming. It wasn't a surprise. And fortunately for me, like I had like a bunch of stuff that I was like working on in terms of fundraising, and so we raised, you know, enough cash to hire everybody back like 2 months later. But oh my gosh, it was just an arduous process of like, guys, I'm sorry, but we're totally out of money, and here's all of your like your officially laid off letters. It sucked.
Yeah. It wasn't a decision per se for me, but we came to within a week of crashing, and I remember like very vividly going into my lab thinking, I won't be doing this next week if we don't close this deal.
Yeah.
And you're just like, oh, like there's these like gut checks as you go that this whole thing is about to go out in flames, and they leave a mark.
I think for me there was yes, definitely. I had to go and have tough relationships and conversations with my co-founder. Realizing that he actually is a great coder and loves working on machine learning, but might not necessarily feel comfortable leading a team. And I think that was when you're having that kind of really hardcore one-to-one marriage type relationship conversations going, is your CTO role right now the right one for you and also for the business? And then subsequently realizing he's happier now, not being the CTO, but then we also had to then actually scale back the team because of, you know, we wasted a bit of time realizing kind of the team structure, but also just understanding that it doesn't make him happy being the CTO. And he's happier now as a co-founder and a tech advisor, because that's just the title he chose, which works on much more machine learning projects on the side as a one-person band, than having to lead the whole entire team.
And I'd add to that, the longer you drag your feet in having that conversation, the worse it will be.
So that's a really interesting topic, and one I don't think we've mentioned, but it's also indecision. And I think that is a big killer for many startups. And sometimes we take the decision to make this or not, but it's, again, not being indecisive about it. The longer you drag something out, the more problems you're going to run into in the long run.
Well, and that is a decision.
Absolutely.
You're deciding not to do anything, and that has consequences.
Yeah.
It's uncomfortable, but it's worth just like biting the bullet.
Yeah. And you're going to have confrontation, like not necessarily just with the co-founders. You're going to have
with your investors,
with everyone.
outside,
And if you're trying to avoid confrontations, then I would advise maybe not to be an entrepreneur because they kind of come hand in hand.
Yeah.
So I'd say we have like 20 seconds left, and so if you're in one sentence to say like the most important thing, good or bad, for anyone to take with them as they leave, what would it be?
Go do try.
Yeah.
That's it.
Get to know yourself really well, because oftentimes the barriers that are really in place are actually our own fears of us holding ourselves back from actually doing what there is to do.
Agree with all of them, and I think what makes us a good, successful entrepreneur, but also a startup, is a problem, not an idea.
That's great.
Yeah. All right.
Good time, Bob.
Well, thank you.